Before I get started, haven't done a video in a while, but I've been feeling under the weather and I'm still kind of getting over it. So, apologies for the stuffiness. I wanted to talk about this threat analysis tool. This is not necessarily a widespread, well known website or tool, whatever you want to call it, especially not as widespread as something like DPS simulators or Warcraft logs. There's not a lot of people that talk about this tool, and it is kind of a niche thing. It really is only going to show you your threat as a graph, or the raid's threat as a graph, I should say. But it is handy, especially if you're a tank. But it can be handy for DPS as well. It's pretty much useless for healers. At least I can't think of any situations where a healer might want to use it. But if you're warrior or druid or whatever, and you plan on tanking, this can help you select, different pieces of gear for certain fights. So here's the link. It's voomlz.github.io, and there is also a Chrome extension. So I use Chrome as my browser. There's a Chrome extension you can get. Let me find the name of it. So it's just called WCL Threat Link. So it's Warcraft Logs Threat Link, and it says link Warcraft Logs to TBCC Threat Graph. And what that does is it gives you a short way to get to this without needing to bookmark it. Because this is, so when you go to the website, you have to go to Warcraft Logs anyway to get your report. So if you want to get the report ID, it's when you get when you get onto Warcraft Logs and you open a report, you copy this URL, that's the report ID, and then you paste it in, and then you hit fetch. And then what that does is, down in the drop down now, you can see this is now populated, and it has all the individual fights. So these are all the trash fights, all the boss fights. So if you wanted to look at, let's say, a Nubricon, you got to find, and this is not really in any order. So, Grobulus is second, even though we didn't fight him second. We fought Grobulus like way down here. So I'm not sure exactly how this is organized, but it can be a pain in the butt to try to find it. And if you wipe, you'll have to, there'll be multiple entries. So you go to Nubricon, and then you go to fetch refresh button here. Okay, and then you can see there's a nice big graph, but it includes the crypt. So if you wanted to see individual crypt guards, you would click on the individual crypt guards. So for fights that include trash, so you can see here, this crypt guard tank was way ahead of everybody else. And then a Nubricon. You mouse over it, it shows you the person's name. And then this is obviously a mage. This is Ignite. But you can see, and then if you highlight, so let's say you want to look at the first 15 seconds of the fight. So then you can see the timeline down here at the bottom now is 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds. So it kind of zooms you in. And then if you double left click, it zooms you back out. So then if you said, well, I want to look at the first 25 seconds, whatever, for whatever reason. So you can zoom in and you can see. And then also, if you click on somebody's name over here, it removes them from the graph. And if you double click their name, it removes everybody but that person. So this is me. And then it tells you all these little points in time are the ability you used and what the threat coefficient was and what the total threat was that you got for that ability. So if I go back, double click me again, it brings everybody back up. So let's look at like patchwork. So actually, let's look at Mexna. So when you select a boss, it doesn't automatically update. You have to hit this refresh button every time. Okay, so you can see here there's, you know, not a lot of threat going on. The main tank opened, and then you can just see where they're that was probably a crit, I'm guessing. Yeah, there's a bloodthirst. 5,500 threat from that bloodthirst. So it says bloodthirst and then what timestamp it was. So it was 7.47 seconds. The threat he got from that was 5539. So it was probably a 2K crit or whatever. And then it got modified by defensive stance and defiance. And then the total threat at that point in time was 16,356. So you can see, that's why you see sometimes these big bumps. Those are probably crits, and they're usually blood. Like there's another bloodthirst that was 2768. So he probably had Death Wish and trinkets up here or something. I don't know. But you can see, you know, like the mages, they're above the tank in some instances, but they're not far enough to pull above to pull threat. Excuse me, but this is a handy tool. And this fight, there's nothing wrong with this fight, but I just wanted to show how this works. Because if you have a boss fight where somebody pulled threat or the tank, you know, ran in and got a bunch of parries, you can see that in the logs. Obviously, if you go to Warcraft logs, you can see that information. But Warcraft logs doesn't do a great job of showing you the threat values. It shows you basically who had threat and who was tanking, but it doesn't show you this graph of kind of like what was going on. So you can see here, like there's a warrior that was catching up. That warrior was probably in defensive stance, I'm guessing. That warrior passed up the tank at one point, but probably didn't pull threat because I don't think they died. So this is the report I'm looking at. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the threat report. So we could go to, let me make sure we're looking at Mexna. We are, right? Yeah, Mexna. And we're just looking at her, not the spiderlings. And then if you go to threat here, yeah, nobody else took threat. So this is kind of useless, but, and then I don't think anybody died either. Yeah, nobody died, nobody pulled threat. But what you can do with this tool also is if you look over here, there's everybody's name, and then there's a decimal or a value assigned to each person's name. And what these are their threat coefficients. So if you look at like Sven here, his is 0.80. That is the default Zerker stance threat coefficient. So what that and this is when this is when combat started. So what that tells me is that he did not have salvation on. And it looks like a lot of people didn't have salvation on because a lot of them are at 0.80. If you see something like this, like New has 0.78. Let's look at New real quick. He probably has an enchant that lowers his threat, I'm guessing. And it might not even show up in Warcraft logs. I think that's a cloak enchant. Yeah, so he has subtlety on his cloak, so it does show up. And that's 2% reduced threat. All that stuff is reflected here. So his threat is actually, you know, 0.02 lower, or 2% lower than the other warriors. Salvation probably got buffed. Let's check his buffs. It probably got buffed after combat started, I'm guessing. Or maybe it didn't get buffed. I don't know. I haven't gone back and looked at this fight. Because what you should see, warriors with salvation on, instead of being a 0.8, they should be 0.56. Because salvation reduces your threat by 30%. I believe it's 30%. Yeah, I don't see anywhere in here where he got the buff salvation or removed it. So that's why it looks like that. Now this person was at 1.3, which is leads me to believe they were in defensive stance. So you can check that. Whoops. So this could be useful for raid leaders as well. So they started off in defensive stance and then swapped to berserker stance. So that is going to throw off their threat. So that's why if you look, he passes up the tank right here and looks like he gets far enough ahead to pull aggro, but that coefficient is wrong because he swapped to Zerker stance right away. It's like 2 seconds into the fight. So what you need to do is, if you want to modify that to say, well, that's wrong, you find the person in here, right here, okay, and you hit fetch release again. And then down at the bottom down here, it says, you know, started fight with a coefficient of 1.3. And then down here they have defensive stance, blessing of salvation, battle stance, berserker stance, you know, all this stuff. So what it's doing is it's inferring from the from the logs that defensive stance was on. I'm going to say no, it was off. Berserker stance says inferred off. I'm going to say on. And that's really the only difference that we need to make. And then it's assuming these talents, which it is correct. And then you go back up and you hit fetch refresh again. Now you see he drops down to 0.8 with everybody else, and then his graph line drops down. So now he's, if we double click him, and then we just want to see where the tank is. So there, that looks much better. So that's actually what happened in the fight, because this doesn't update buffs. It's just like Warcraft logs. You have to get the buff in combat, but once combat starts with this, it doesn't update your coefficients. So you might have to do that manually. So I'm just going to double click, get everybody back. The mages didn't pull threat because they have to be at 100 and whatever it is, 20% to pull threat. So even though the range has passed him up, that's why they didn't pull. Let's look at, oops. Let's look at like patchwork. So, or let's look at Noth. Oh, okay, let's not look at Noth. Let's look at, I'm trying to find one where the tank was just miles ahead. Let's look at Gluth. I think usually, I can't remember if I tank Gluth or not. Yeah. Okay, so this is what this can be useful for. And again, it looks like the Warriors didn't have salve, even though I think that they did. I'm not sure why it's not reflecting that. I think they're getting salve after combat starts. Let's go to Gluth. And let's look at, is it Greater Blessing of Salvation? Yeah, maybe they didn't have it. I don't know. I'll have to go back and see. Yeah, it says only one person got it. But that's during the fight. That won't show up if it was on before. But according to the logs, it's looking like it wasn't there. But anyway, as a tank, what you can do with this information, if you look at it, obviously. So what I normally do with Gluth is I start out with Death Wish. So let's go to damage. Actually, let's go to casts and then go to me. And then go to timelines. So I drink a Greater Stone Shield as soon as I'm out of the pipe. And then I blow Death Wish, Kiss of the Spider. And then I start, obviously, my rotation. And then Gluth is undead, so my other trinket is the Mark of the Champion. So I don't have any other trinkets. So I'm just using that trinket, Death Wish, and then I've got... let's see. I Death Wish up, it looks like, for most of the fight, about half of it. Excuse me. So I have Death Wish up till about the 30-second mark, and then it falls off. And then the other warriors are usually death wishing. So you see, that's where they start kind of catching up. There's 2 or 3 of them that start catching me near the end. But what you can use this information for is to decide, do I need to wear more threat gear? Or can I get away if I put a couple extra pieces of mitigation on? So, like, if we look, I'm pretty much wearing full threat gear already. This is not a DMF week, by the way. So I'm missing a couple. Like, I don't have the neck off KT. I don't have the legs off of Lotheb. But everything else is pretty much threat gear. I don't have the bow or I don't have the crossbow off of KT. But looking at this chart, I could probably say, well, if I, let's say you die 2 weeks in a row, and or you get some new healers in the guild, or whatever is going on, you could go back into all your different logs and look and say, yeah, that these last couple of glues felt really good. Let's look at it. And you look at your threat and it looks like this. You can lose a couple pieces of threat gear and put on like 2-piece tier 3, or change your rings out, or put on life-giving gem, or whatever you want to do. Because if you're not parsing, if you're not actively trying to parse, then your only goal is to survive and hold threat. And if you look at this, like I mean right in here, I was really close to losing threat to new, but I probably had, if I look at my events and my attacks, I probably had a couple misses and parries and dodges here, and then I got a crit bloodthirst. There's 5,300 threat I got from that bloodthirst, and then after that it just was off to the races. So obviously your opener is usually the most important as a tank. Once you get the opener and you establish threat, the rest is pretty much gravy. But you can make gear choices based on looking at this information. And let's look at patchwork just to kind of like solidify that. Thaddeus, Saffron, where's patchwork? So when you do patchwork, make sure it's not including any trash mobs or whatever. This looks really weird. I don't know why. I know that that's Ignite, but at this level, he should have pulled off for me. But my threat value... So usually when I see something like this, I'll look over here and it'll say that I started the fight with like 1.1 or something like that. Because it's assuming that... Let's actually check my stuff. Defensive stance on, salvation off, 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 off. Defiance 3 out of 3. I don't have tactical mastery, but that doesn't change anything. So it looks correct. So maybe it's just showing the wrong threat value for Ed. But at any rate, he didn't pull off me on this fight, and we can prove that by, again, going back to logs, go to patchwork, go to threat, and then you could see I started tanking him and then I never lost threat. And actually, the mages didn't even... I mean, they did pretty good, but they didn't out DPS some of the warriors, so... There are times that I've seen some of these numbers look a little skewed. Battle chickens around there. Yeah, something... I don't know if this has given him all the... I mean, it's given him all the threat from the Ignite, but at any rate, what I'm concerned about is all these other warriors, which one of the warriors was starting to get close towards the end here. Let's see, was he the top? Yeah, he was top DPS. So that's Execute. So Execute, just as a sidebar conversation, Execute does a different threat value than all your other abilities. So when warriors start executing, their threat is going to start climbing, and you can see that. They're on a pretty steady pace, and then right around where he enters execute range, which looks to be right in here, you can see all the warriors start climbing. And that's not because they're removing salve or anything crazy. That's just execute. Execute does more threat than standard abilities, even with salve on, even with berserkers, even with berserker stance. So, but you can see through here, and let's look at the off tanks. So, who was tanking? Ort was one. And I think Hundel was the other one. Oh, he died. Yeah, Hundel died. He's down here. So Hundel, yeah, look, Hundel died pretty quick. You're really only concerned on this fight of staying above the other tanks. And you can see that I'm pretty far ahead. And I'm wearing a decent amount of mitigation, but I do have some threat pieces thrown in. And based on this just single fight, which I would not base it on a single fight, I would go pull other weeks and other logs, especially DMF. Like if you want to look and really judge your gear, you want to see, what weeks did people keep a lot of their buffs, and then what weeks did we have DMF, and then look at your threat on those and see how far ahead you were. Double click this to get everybody back on here. Let's look at like I'm sure Thaddeus is going to be nuts, but let's look at Noth is another one where you usually go pretty crazy with DPS gear. Yeah, see, this one looks a lot closer. Let's look at Crypt Reaver now. Not Fairlina. And you can look at trash as well. So if you look at Fairlina, whoops. Where did she go? Okay, she just disappeared. I don't know, I just clicked on something there. Unless I'm just blind. She was right above Hagen, I thought. But what I was going to say is you can click on like Fairlina and then you can look at the individual targets. I'm going to close this out. So this is a good opportunity to show the threat graph button. So everybody's probably pretty familiar with going in the Warcraft logs, but if you get that Chrome extension, that Warcraft logs extension, it puts the threat graph button here. So then what you can do is you can go ahead and go to the fight you want to look at. And then I just right click and open in a new window, and it will automatically populate the report ID for you. And she's missing from this list too. Oh, there she is. I'm like, I am going blind. So we pull up Fairlina, and then you can look at, the followers, the worshippers. It's not going to show you which one was Skull and which one was X. Excuse me. I know this one was Skull because I was taking it, and you can see like this is, these get cleaved down in our raid. But like if you have a follower that's just like running around crazy, you can pull this up and then see, oh, there's no tank on it. Everybody's casting on it or whatever. Like the worshippers, those get cleaved down. They have a tank, but they die pretty quick and then they get sacrificed. Let's go back to Fairlina. Let's look at like the first. So it's a little easier to see when you see like the first 10 seconds of the fight. So here's the tank. And again, so here his threat value says 1.05. That's wrong. He probably had salvation on in the logs, but then tanks usually have a macro to take that off. So let's change that to, first I gotta find them. Now these are in alphabetical order, thankfully. Now I'll do fetch release again. And then defensive stance on, salvation off. So that's right. Greater blessing of salvation on. Let's say off. And then fetch release again. That should make it look a little nicer. And then you can just look and see first, first 12 seconds of the fight is a little, that's when you're trying to get her in position, but you can see how close the other melee are getting. And then once you get past that like 12-second mark, so again, these are the seconds at the bottom, the threat just starts skyrocketing. There could have been, and again, let's see like what happened. Damage done for Orts, and then we'll do events. So you got a Bloodthirst, Glancing, so Heroic Strike parry, melee parry, revenge parry. So there's a couple parries right there at 3 seconds. Heroic Strike parry. Resisted the Sapper. Dodge. Got another good Bloodthirst there. So it wasn't a terrible opener, but when does it start taking off? At 12 seconds. You got crit, 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 crit. Big Bloodthirst crit in there too. 2600 Bloodthirst crit. So he had a nice crit to open, but I don't think he had any trinkets or buffs up yet because it was only 1300. And then, like I said, bunch of parries. Parry, resist, dodge, parry, glance. Excuse me. So that's how you can use this tool. Like I said, it's pretty handy. I've used it quite a bit in the past. And even if you have a specific week in mind, or if you want to look at your, like, let's say I want to look at, let's look at this. Let's say I want to look at like my best parse ever. You can go to that, and then as soon as you get on it, then you get the URL, or right click, open the threat graph. And then hit fetch, and then we're going to look at patchwork. So this was the best patchwork parse I've ever had. It was a 99, and it was, I forget what the rank was, but 11, almost 1200 DPS. And then I'm obviously near the bottom, like tanks, even when you parse as a tank, you're usually near the bottom. But then if you look at the threat graph, like there was just no way anybody was catching me. I was, even the mage, I think the mage is 99 as well. So this is one of the fights that made me decide to put on a little bit more, if I remember correctly, decided to make me put on a little bit more mitigation, because and was this DMF week? Let's look. It probably was, but let's look at me, look at buffs. Yep, DMF right there. So this was a DMF week. I had a chicken, well, near the end, but still. I had Rend. I had Kiss of the Spider. Yeah, I had all the buffs. So as long as I've got, all those buffs, and then the mages obviously had their buffs. Yep, a DMF there. Power infusion, combustion. Other buffs here. Even with all that, they still didn't come close to pulling threat. I mean, I was miles ahead. This doesn't show percentages, but at the end of the fight, they were at 200k, and this is all the mages combined with Ignite, and I was over 50,000 above them. So you can use it for, as a tank or as a DPS. Like, you can look at this as a DPS. And as a DPS, you got to be more careful on patchwork, because you're not worried about the main tank's threat. You're worried about the off tank's threat. So here's one of the off tanks. Here's the other off tank. But you can see that, it looks like, and again, I don't know if this has got the coefficient wrong. It says 0.56, which is correct. but Sven was the only one that was even remotely close, and he still wasn't really close. He was pretty far away from passing up the off tanks. The ranged can pass the off tanks, the melee cannot. Let's look at Gluth on this one. Yeah, here's Gluth on that week. I mean, I was just ridiculously far ahead at the end of the fight. But you're still going to want to gear based... I try to gear based on the first 20 seconds of the fight, not the whole entire fight. Because if you're wearing, like, say, 4-piece tier 3, or you put on life-giving gem or whatever, you're going to gimp your overall threat, but your opener is also going to suck a lot worse. And that's the opener is really the key. Now, another thing you could do is, you know, at the 20, let's say the 25-second mark, I could put a shield on and just leave a shield on the rest of the fight. Same thing on Patchwork, same thing on, you know, let's look at Grabulus. I don't take Grabulus, but yeah, like the mage was keeping up with the warrior, but look how far ahead he is than the melee. I mean, if it's not for the mages, and if you don't have mages that pump this hard in your guild, that's fine. But like, if you look at this, like, let's say we just take the mage out of there. Like, I would just look at this and say, you're wearing way too much Strek gear. You know, unless you're trying to parse. When you want to get a 99 or 100, that's fine. But on a regular week, in DMF weeks, we usually are trying to parse. But everybody else down here has buffs too. So, you know, you could put a shield on. And Grabulus is not a super dangerous boss, but you at least know, like, I probably got a cushion, you know, because you're not always staring at the threat meter. Sometimes you are, sometimes you're, like Grabulus, you're worried about backing up, getting the melee out of the gas, whatever. But I used to I don't look at this as often anymore, but I used to look at this every single week. And I would go back and I would look at the bosses that I tanked. 4 Horsemen is going to be odd to look at, but threat is usually not a consideration of 4 Horsemen. It's all about mechanics. Yeah, I mean, see, there's so many taunts going out and threat swaps, and it's spaghetti noodles to look at this thing. Look at Lady B. Just like, this is all the marks going out. The marks drop your threat. But like a Nubricon, I think, was I tanking? Yeah, I was tanking a Nubricon. So like a Nubricon, I probably don't need to wear as much threat as I do. On DMF, I definitely try to parse. But the mages start catching up, but they just don't have enough time. The boss doesn't live long enough. It died in 35 or 36 seconds. They just don't have enough time to get that ignite going to pass up, you know, the tank. So, but anyway, this is a very handy tool. Like I said, I've been using it for quite a while. I don't use it as often anymore. Because once you kind of learn your raid, your guild, and who the pumpers, who died, who didn't die, who lost buffs, who still has buffs, who didn't get rend, you know, that type of thing. You kind of can on the fly make a decision about what your gear is going to be for that particular boss. But I use this specifically to figure out what gear I should wear on Patchwork to keep the mages off of me, because the mages are really the only things that I ever have to worry about. But yeah, so that's the threat tool. It's pretty easy to use. It took me a long time to kind of figure out how to navigate through it and learn how to look at everybody's coefficients and make sure, you know, like I said, sometimes when you look in here and you look at buffs, like I don't see salvation. That doesn't mean he didn't have it, because Warcraft logs sometimes doesn't pick it up either unless it happened in combat. But like if you end up getting passed up by somebody, which I off the top of my head I can't think of a report I could go look to show you guys, but if you get passed up by somebody in threat, and then you come and look in the logs and you don't, and you're like, oh, they didn't have salvation. That doesn't always mean they didn't have salvation. Let's just pick a random warrior. So according to this, there's no salvation. Yeah, Greater Blood, I don't see it in the list. But that usually just means that they started the fight, like it was buffed out of combat. I don't know why Warcraft Logs picks up these other buffs, but it can't pick up raid buffs like Fortitude and whatnot. But then if you look in here, he's at 0.56, which is what he's supposed to be at. So I would say he did have salvation. And the only way to really verify that is to go look at a stream. If that person streamed. Or if you stream, then you have an add-on that shows what people's buffs are or whatever. All right, well, if anybody has any questions about this tool, how it works, I mean, I don't, there's, or how to use it, I should say. I know that it does say Wrath logs are not compatible with the tool. I don't play Wrath, so as far as I'm aware, this works just fine on Fresh and on Anniversary. I haven't rated on Anniversary yet, but I would assume that it does work there, because it's basically the same as Era. Probably doesn't work on Sod. You know, I don't know if it accounts for all the different new talents and abilities and whatnot. But for Era and for Fresh, this is a pretty handy tool. So, all right. Well, I'll see you guys in the next video.